Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Transition Accelerator webinar, Markets versus Public Power Systems, Meeting Canada's Net Zero Electricity Goals. Thank you so much for joining. We're excited to have you all with us today. I want to start off our session today, as we always do, with the land acknowledgement. The Transition Accelerator, with staff across Canada, acknowledges the traditional territories of the Indigenous peoples on which we work and live. We recognize and respect the ongoing relationships that Indigenous peoples have to the land, and we commit to the ongoing process of reconciliation. So with that, I'd like to get us started. I'll give a few intro remarks and then I'll introduce our panelists and we'll be off and running. Obviously, electricity powers every aspect of our lives, from homes and businesses to critical infrastructure. So understanding how we plan, build, and operate those systems can greatly influence our ability to achieve a resilient, sustainable, and cost-effective energy future. In this conversation today, we're going to focus on Alberta's electricity grid because it really stands out as a unique model in Canada. It's a deregulated, market-based, majority private system that has been instrumental in rapidly deploying low-cost renewables. This is in contrast to other provinces that mostly have regulated, majority publicly owned systems. As Alberta sets its sights on achieving net zero electricity by 2050, the stakes are exceptionally high. Achieving this goal will require unprecedented levels of private sector investment in new generation capacity. However, while the framing of this webinar focuses on Alberta, it is also important, I think, today to recognize that the debate over market-based electricity systems versus other models is certainly not unique to the province. This is a discussion playing out across North America. In the US, for instance, many jurisdictions with similar market-based systems are confronting the same challenges. How could these markets be reformed to meet the pressing goals of affordability, reliability, and net zero emissions? Given this broader context, today's webinar will delve into the potential and pitfalls of both market and non-market electricity systems. We're going to use Alberta as a particularly relevant and timely case study, but our focus will be broader. So rather than focus on the minutiae of Alberta's specific market rules, we're going to try to tease out some of the bigger lessons we're learning from the province. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our three expert panelists for today's webinar. Blake Schaefer is joining us from the University of Calgary, and he's actually kindly stepping in to replace Sarah Hastings-Simon today, who wasn't able to join us. So thank you, Blake. And we have Edgardo Sepulveda with us, an independent economist in Toronto, and Leonard Kula, a vice president at the Canadian Renewable Energy Association. I'm going to ask each of them to just introduce themselves very quickly, a few minutes each. I'd like you to give sort of, where you're based, what you're doing, why you think it's interesting. Just pretend you're at a party and give us a little bit of a summary. But then also, we'd really like to kind of ask you all to frame a little bit your thinking around what your pitch would be for a pro-market electricity system in Alberta or a pro-public one. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Blake to get us started. Blake.
Okay, thanks very much, Jane. And first off, apologies to the attendees today who were hoping and expecting to see Sarah. I realize the disappointment, but I will do my best to be here in her shoes. My background, so yes, currently I'm a professor of economics at the University of Calgary, but before academia, I had a 15-year career in the electricity sector. And I guess I've lived both worlds, both sides of the debate we're going to have today. I started my career at BC Hydro, and ended up in Wall Street for a while, so quite different, and then finished my career as head trader at TransAlta, so here in the bastion of that competitive or deregulated market Jane mentioned. We'll have probably debates back and forth, but I would say right out of the gate that I'm not ardently pro one side or another. I have the feeling or suspicion I'm going to be backing some of the market side a little bit today in the conversation. But I'm not market over everything. I see some of the benefits that it provides in sort of responsiveness, ease of entry, quickness to adjust to changing conditions, like responding to the rapid decline in renewables costs very quickly. But I also see some of the pitfalls, some of the challenges. if you're looking at something like nuclear or large hydro reservoir, 70, 90, 100-year assets, you just simply can't compete with the public discount rates possible as compared to what is needed in the private sector. And sort of speed of change that's able to be accomplished in a public system or regulated system. I've also been privy to many of the errors that public systems can make, and I think we all have seen those. And so I'm well aware of that potential risk. So I look forward to the conversation and hearing from Edgardo and Leonard and all of the attendees today.
Thank you so much. Edgardo, over to you. Oh, Edgardo, we can't hear you. I think you might be on mute.
Okay, there you go. All right.
There you go.
Thank you. All right. I'm going to use my 3 minutes, my 3 or 4 minutes to introduce myself. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. It's Edgardo Sepulveda, Toronto, Canada. I'm an independent telecoms and electricity economist. What I wanted to do is provide some of the work that I've been doing for a report that I've just prepared for the Alberta Federation of Labor that deals specifically with these topics. So what are my 2 pitches? 1, Alberta should reimpose economic regulation. And 2, it should return to a balanced ownership mix by creating a crown corporation. Like I said, by reading of the evidence that I presented in this report that's upcoming in October, is that going forward, the private market approach that is being tried in Alberta has not, and going forward is unlikely to meet the public interest.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and then
sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt.
I'm sorry. Okay, I was going to have a bit more.
Yes, go ahead.
But yeah, so basically, I wanted to show some of the findings that I have, looking at prices, reliability, and profits. My report analyzed the level and change in prices over 40 years for residential and industrial users. It all leads to the same conclusion. Prices in Alberta since 2001 are higher and have increased faster than the rest of Canada, especially starting in 2021. Also, volatile electricity prices in Alberta hurt lower income residents because they do not have the means to navigate retail competition and thus end up paying higher prices than other households. How about reliability? Those of you who live in Alberta will remember the cell phone alerts that you received in January urging you to conserve electricity. Alberta dodged that bullet, but not the blackout in 2020 in April. These are not isolated incidents. Since 2022, Alberta has accounted for fully 1/3 of grid alerts in the US and Canada, while making up less than 2% of the continental grid. The promise of deregulation is lower prices overall, even if prices and profits go up and down over the investment cycle. Well, this graphic certainly shows that volatility. But what you also see is a textbook case of profit-driven price gouging, with excess profits starting in 2021. Above average profits and prices over the investment cycle. That was not what was promised. All perfectly legal because in Alberta decided to stop controlling profits. And to close off with the last slide, the prices did not spike in other provinces in 2021. Why? Because profits are controlled elsewhere, or they have a public crown corporation with a power at cost mandate. Contrast the steady blue bars of controlled profits with the Alberta red bars, or compare the high and volatile prices in Alberta. To close, the biggest winners in Alberta's market experiment have been its private generation companies and their shareholders. It is not too late to make price gouging illegal. The answer can be found in Alberta's recent past and in the rest of Canada. Alberta should reimpose economic regulation and return to a balanced ownership mix by creating a crown corp. Thank you.
Thank you, Edgardo. I like a I like a real opinion. This is fantastic for kicking things off. That's great. I'm now going to pass it over to you, Leonard. Give us a little taste of what your work is and how you see this issue.
Great. Thanks, Jane, and good afternoon, everyone. Leonard Kula, Vice President of Policy for Eastern Canada with the Canadian Renewable Energy Association. So essentially, I'm involved in primarily Newfoundland to Ontario. I have a colleague, Evan Wilson, who looks after Western Canada and the federal file at CanREA. This is my second year at CanREA. I had a 36-ish year career in the electricity sector before that. 23 or so years at the Independent Electricity System Operator in Ontario. So I was there basically from the creation of the AESO, was there at the opening of the market, was involved in a lot of initiatives to expand the market. And at one point in time, I was responsible for real-time operation of the power system and electricity markets and long-term planning. In those roles, I also had exposure to what's going on across North America. About 2/3 of the continent are covered by what we call independent system operators that operate markets and power systems. And so there are examples. So the Alberta equivalent is the AESO. They're the two Canadian instances, and there are 7 groups in the United States. So I've seen a lot of aspects of it. With that introduction, a couple of thoughts. I'm going to kind of sound like Blake in many ways, even though our experiences come from different places, and maybe some nuance. So I'm not, solely a market purist at the exclusion of everything else. So when you look at either end of the continuum, full market in all its glory versus full regulation, I'm probably somewhere in the middle, trying to find the right balance of each. I do note that words like markets mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. There's a real-time balancing market to balance supply and demand on a second-to-second basis, and that's typically called the market. Making sure that the megawatts are built is also sometimes considered a market, whereas others look at it as competition. Mm-hmm. So you've got those aspects. I note, given the breadth of things that I've seen, I've noted that centrally planned systems struggle in a world with rapid change. And I find Edgardo's observations interesting, but I will raise this point. What's happened in the next 20 years is not going to, in the past 20 years, is not going to resemble what's going to happen in the next 20 years. Electricity systems across the continent are projecting a doubling of the electricity system, transmission, generation, other things, to go ahead and manage the energy transition. And so we're facing a significant change, both in quantity of resources we need, as well as technologies. We're going to be relying upon technologies that either don't exist today or exist today, but are not being used at the penetrations that they are going to be used 5, 10, 15 years from now. And that's going to be really, really different. On the other side of the ledger, I've had enough experience with pure markets around the continent where they believe in market integrity, market purity, markets rule everything. And those markets really struggle whenever there are policy levers, because they don't fit their market model. And politicians are going to pull policy levers. Blake's already alluded to nuclear and long-lived hydroelectric assets, which really don't fit a market model. So while there are issues with regulation and trying to manage innovation and rapid change and cost, on the market side of things, there are also challenges with they need to be adaptable. That when a government says, I want to put in 25% nuclear and pulls that policy lever, the markets have to be able to handle it in an effective way. And with that, I will stop, and hopefully that sets a good foundation for the debate from here.
It certainly does. Thank you so much, Leonard. I think I want to pick up actually on the framing you've laid out to kick off our discussion. So I think you raised a really interesting point that centrally planned systems can struggle with rapid change. And, I sit here in Manitoba where we're dealing with a centrally planned system, and we certainly have been struggling with the kind of, moving the government levers to achieve the kind of massive change in the systems we are wanting to see in the next 20 years. But I think we've also noted from the earlier comments, and as you said, market-based grids can also struggle with kind of responding to bigger signals. So Blake, maybe I'll ask you to start, kick us off on this discussion with the following question. I mean, Alberta has seen an incredible rise in renewables development compared to other provinces. So can market-based systems deliver the investments we need to achieve net zero electricity? I mean, is it theoretically possible to design a set of rules and incentives for to incentivize the private investment we need here?
I certainly think so. And you're right. The things we've seen, if you look across Canada, Len probably has the number off the top of his head, but I think it's over 90% of renewables been built in Alberta and out of the whole country have been in Alberta in the last 5 years. If you look at the US, Texas, I think in the next 18 months is building more wind, solar, battery capacity than the next 10 biggest states combined. And they are our analog in terms of market design. So I think one of the things that the competitive or a market where you can have someone come and enter, connect and manage, so to speak, allows for is if there's economic opportunities in that space, they can respond really quickly. And I think one of the things we see with centrally planned, your main utility has to go in front of its utility commission, present that integrated resource plan. So in Manitoba, they go and do this. That process takes 1 to 2 years at times. They're relying on cost estimates, like expert cost estimates that come from reports maybe a year prior. Those reports might be even using data from a year prior. Suddenly you're using 4-year-old stale data, which for many years in the electricity system, when I was certainly involved, that was okay. But when you have cost declines, like 90% cost declines in solar, technological improvements in nuclear happening these days, you need to be able to respond quicker. And I say that is one of the advantages that the market-based system allows for. I don't want to monopolize the time, but one of the things I would sort of concede to Edgardo in terms of when we look at market-based is, yes, you are going to come with a lot more volatility. We see that in prices. Edgardo showed some of those slides, although I don't think I'll bother pulling up my slides. But if you fast forward to now, I just posted on Twitter, we're back down into the realm of every other province in Canada now. So we've come back down that quickly. Reliability events, Edgardo's pointing out to a really important aspect there. Yeah, we've had a lot of emergency events. So it doesn't come without hiccups. And I'd say those reliability events are in part because renewables came on so much faster than our grid operator expected. We're deficient in important things like fast frequency response and whatnot. We're catching up, but it came on so quickly that it wasn't there in time.
Yeah, I think, Leonard, maybe you could speak a little bit to the reliability point, and then Edgardo, I want you to jump in on the affordability piece. So how does Alberta's electrical utility model stack up against other provinces when it comes to reliability, Leonard?
Excellent question. So in my own evolution of thought over the last 2 decades or so, because I was a very, very much a market purist when we opened the electricity market in Ontario. And I've become more of a market pragmatist as time has gone on. And looked at the data around me and tried to make sense of things. And the conclusion that I have come to is that reliability and market purity are like a teeter-totter. Mm-hmm. And so if you want market purity, where markets are, balancing supply and demand in real time, but also providing the incentives to build new things, you depend upon, and Alberta is an example of it, and Texas is another example of it as well, energy-only markets that really depend upon real-time outcomes to drive those longer-term investments. Mm-hmm. And so that depends upon scarcity and volatility and uncertainty to drive those sustained, prices high enough to support investment and operate in real time. But from a person who was responsible for making sure that the light stayed on in Ontario, volatility and uncertainty are words that frighten us, or would frighten me. And so the minute that you start to say, hey, you know what, reliability is a thing that I really need to worry about, well, then you put in belts and suspenders and checks and balances to go ahead and make sure that you've got a reliable system.
Mm-hmm.
So in Ontario, transmitters and generators have to apply to go ahead and take their equipment out of service. And if there was a reliability impact, then we would reject that request. We get 15,000 of these requests per year. The minute you start doing that, you are guaranteeing or increasing the likelihood that you will have enough supply to meet supply and demand. That reduces volatility, that reduces uncertainty, that attenuates prices. Now suddenly you don't have that that long run high price signal to drive investment.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the thing is, you got to start with, what is your highest priority? This notion of market purity and an energy only market driving investment, or do you want a reliable system? And as I said, they're like a teeter-totter. So the more that you emphasize reliability, the more that you are going to attenuate prices, which means that stuff doesn't get built, which means you need a different mechanism to get it built. So I think you need to start from a place of what's most important to you, having a market drive investment, or to have a reliable system, because in many ways they are incompatible.
I mean, I think everywhere we would agree that reliability is absolutely key when we're talking about electricity. And so let's go back to those power outages in Texas a few years back that maybe showed state's electricity system wasn't up to the task of providing sufficient energy during extreme weather events. So it's one thing to have planned outages, but what about the fact that climate change is going to drive more extreme weather events more often? What can Alberta learn from what we saw happening in Texas, and indeed what we saw even here in Canada over the last 6 months? So how are we going to be able to adjust to try to deal with those types of things?
So the Texas event, and we studied it because, of course, you're looking to draw lessons to make sure that similar things don't happen in your jurisdiction. But there was a lot going on in Texas. They had issues with gas supply. They lost 50% of their generation. You can't manage a system with that amount of catastrophic failure. But I think that when you get right down to the base of it, so Texas is a 75 gigawatt system. Alberta's a 12-ish gigawatt system. So Texas is about 6 times bigger than Alberta. Mm-hmm. And they operate like an electrical island. Their connections to the rest of the world is about 1,000 megawatts. So 1/75 of peak demand is able to be supplied from outside. So they had no support other than themselves. And they designed a system that would support volatility, scarcity, all those kinds of things. And when things went really wrong, because the polar vortex made its all the way down to Texas, they had no backup system. So they designed their power system, they designed their market to go ahead and operate on that knife's edge, which principally gives them the investment in climate to go ahead and build new investment. If that's what you want to do, well, that's cool, but you need to be willing to accept the consequences of when things go wrong, because your whole system has been designed that way. As time goes on, as weather becomes, having more pronounced impacts on our lives, I think people increasingly are going to say reliability is a bigger thing for us, and therefore we want to go ahead and assure that we've got a reliable system. And so what might have been acceptable from a reliability standpoint 20 years ago isn't going to be the same 5-10 years from now. And that's going to have impact on how people run their power systems and design their markets.
And Jane, if I can just jump in on
please.
one comment Len made, just so I'm not picking on Edgardo the whole time, I'll pick on something Len just said, that markets are not compatible with reliability. I think I heard something, I don't think I heard it exactly correct. But I think one thing to make clear is, the notion of a competitive market system is broadly encompassing. Alberta and Texas are these energy-only markets with some ancillary services. But importantly, we don't have these resource adequacy mechanisms, the things that guarantee supply. Whereas you look at a lot of other markets, look at PJM, the biggest electricity market in the world, has a capacity market. And so they go and procure for that very reason, to make sure that they have long run resource adequacy. We all have ancillary services to deal with short run security issues. You look at some places like in Europe that have strategic reserves, and Alberta's actually just sent some fire opening salvos that we might go down that path of strategic reserves. California has a specific resource adequacy product to go and guarantee these. So you can have those as other products if you feel your energy only market through its scarcity pricing isn't delivering you the reliability you need. So I just wanted to sort of make sure that.
No, I think that's a really useful point. I want to move from the technical fixes that you could be making and adjustments you could be making as we learn from kind of what the headwinds are as we move forward into the political possibility of moving forward with these types of systems. And I think this takes us a little bit into more what Edgardo was getting at with affordability issues. And so let's talk a little bit about, Edgardo, maybe you can talk a little bit about, is it politically possible to move market-based system like Alberta's into the kind of rapid build-out we need? And is the political affordability piece driving some of your thinking about creating the fact that Alberta should create a Crown Power Corporation? Then I'll throw it to the others to comment on your thoughts.
Muted.
Yeah, I'm muted now. Great. Thank you, Jane. Yeah, excellent question. I mean, look, I think, you know, obviously decarbonization, affordability and reliability are very important. And so think of it as a tripod. And so we have to kind of take care of all of them. And we have to think about in the real world of political economy, of imperfect institutions, imperfect humans who are managing that process. We have to be sure that we, you know, introduce the best system, given all those constraints, that's going to provide us, you know, in the public interest over the long run. Focusing on affordability, fundamental. No political party, no government is going to be able to withstand the political pressure associated with affordability. Len knows very well what happened in Ontario in 2002, when basically the shortest market experiment in the world, the Ontario market, they pulled the rug on the Ontario market as a result of affordability problems after 5 or 6 months. It lasted 5 or 6 months, and then the government said, we can't handle the truth. We can't handle the truth of having retail markets, retail rates set by wholesale rates. What happened in 2022 and 2023 in Alberta? People started calling their MLAs, and what did they do? The government said, oh, we may be market purists, but we recognize the political pressure of affordability. What did they do? They issued $1 billion worth of rebates to consumers, and they deferred another $200 million to be paid afterwards. Again, market intervention by so-called market purists when the political pressure comes on strongly associated with affordability. Remember what was happening? Alberta rates were doubling and tripling. Yes, they're lower now, but we had 3 years of astronomical profits and price gouging. And why was price gouging allowed? Because it's meant to. The market system does not control profits. It doesn't control prices. It allows the market, especially in Alberta, which is a small, highly concentrated market, to set prices and profits. And so who is left holding the bag other than consumers? Once in a while, the consumers will call your politicians and say, this is too much. And so what we see there is $1 billion worth of rebates. We have a similar situation in Ontario. The Ontario government subsidizes retail tariffs here in Ontario, electricity to the tune of $7.3 billion. So, and that's affordability. That's an affordability crisis brought on by past policies. Anyway, I'll just say that the political economy of these electricity systems are driven by the third rail of affordability, especially now when everyone is talking about affordability, about inflation. And so we see that happening in Ontario, we see that happening in Alberta, and I think we will continue to see that what people want are low, stable prices. And I think what we've seen over, decades, a century of the public utility model, the regulated public utility model, whether it's private or public, I prefer a bit of a flavor for public, but whether private or public, regulated public utilities that get at the nub of the problem, which is market power in a concentrated sector to deal with directly with profits, and you get lower prices.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm gonna let Blake and Leonard jump in on this. I mean, I think we've talked about how we're looking at something quite different in the next 20 years or so in terms of how much power we need to build. So prices are going to rise everywhere. So how are we thinking about this question of affordability and how that might affect the politics of this? Blake, why don't you start us off, and then Leonard, feel free to jump in.
Sure. I mean, yeah, no debate on the importance of affordability. I remember a political economy professor telling me once that, price spikes are one of the biggest indicators of a government overthrow to be happening. And you do see this tension because it's on. Electricity is one of these things that, God forbid we don't deal with it directly. You don't want that, but we all use it indirectly through devices in our home, and we all see those monthly bills, and they're a big portion of our budget. And so when you have these unexpected shocks, that is really important. I would echo what Edgardo said in that this is not a market versus regulated thing. The subsidies that Ontario is providing to prevent bill shock make Alberta's look like a thimble. British Columbia, where I'm from, has billion-dollar deferral accounts that they pass money between ratepayers and taxpayers. This is not a market thing. The difference on market, as Edgardo noted in his slide deck, and we observed, and I think I did probably several hundred interviews over the past several years, was we had a huge price event from 2021 to 2023. I've written papers on this as to the reasons why, and it does stem from a tightening of concentration and market power that occurred then. But it's really important to point out that 70% of Albertan residential customers are on fixed energy rates and aren't feeling that shock. Most industrial customers hedge. Most generators, almost all renewable generators are on contract for differences, so fixed price hedges. Most thermal generators increase their hedging up to at least 75%. So there's the role that contracts play in markets really mitigate some of the volatility that you see in those charts, the charts that show what the price in the spot market is doing. The one thing that I think Alberta didn't do well at all through that price spike is when you look at that 30% of folks that didn't get on a fixed rate. I mean, I'm paying 6 cents per kilowatt hour for my energy, plus another 7 cents or so for delivery. But this is cheap. This is no big deal. I've been paying that for almost 5 years. The problem is if you're low income or you have a poor credit score, you have difficulty accessing those fixed rates. I can't tell you how many times I've spoken to folks in policy making roles saying this is an easy fix. The government could credit back those folks so that they can get on fixed rates, lowers the risks of default. For the life of me, I don't know why that hasn't happened. But giving people access to those fixed rates, I know the government is now looking at changing our default rate to be more stable. But we could have just done that through the existing mechanisms we have that are available to all Albertans. I just think it's really important to note that while we see volatility in the wholesale market, it doesn't need to translate down to the consumer. And like I said, 70% of folks, that's not been the case.
Ben, over to you.
Thanks. So maybe two thoughts, and I'll try to be brief. Moving forward, as Edgardo said, we need to balance affordability, reliability, and clean as three goals that sometimes work together, sometimes not so much. as we make these major transformations of the electricity system, doubling the amount of electricity that is generated and used, with the transmission to go along with it. In Ontario, there's been big plays. The government's made a big play for more hydroelectric, more nuclear. But it takes a while to build those things. And so upwards of 20 years until we start to see those things. But in the meantime, the electricity system is going to transform. And so managing that transition is going to be absolutely huge. Edgardo makes a point around, the rebates that are here in Ontario. That's, to pay for a variety of policy choices and a variety of different technologies. But part of it was, is the renewables file. So there are about between 8,000 and 9,000 megawatts of wind and solar installed and operating in Ontario. Some of that was acquired under feed-in tariff programs that may not have been appropriately priced, but some of that supply was very competitively priced, done through competitive procurements, and we often forget that. We often think of the worst-case scenarios. And both the government and in Ontario, the Independent Electricity System Operator has signaled that we're going to be going through new rounds of procurements as the need for supply starts to pick up. And they're going to use, the lessons have been learned over the past 20 years, and they've had a lot of recent successes with procurements of resources, and they're signaling that that's the way forward moving on from here. So I think that the lessons of the past are instructive. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be repeating the errors of the past.
So what I'm hearing, pardon me, what I'm hearing from both of you is that you agree with a lot of what Edgardo's laying out as some of the issues that Alberta's been facing, but maybe not that a new provincially owned Crown Corp and a provincial financing entity are necessary to fix some of those problems. Is that right, Lynn?
So I made the point earlier, there are certain things that can be very competitively provided by private entities, renewables being an example, and Alberta is a case study for that. For longer lived assets, and Blake made this point in his opening comments, things like if Alberta or other jurisdictions want to go heavily into nuclear, that's probably a public policy, public ownership type of approach rather than, hey, let's have people bid on nuclear. Large-scale hydroelectric is probably the same thing. So there's a certain class of resources that better fit a public ownership model, however you want to do that. And there are certain things that you can benefit from the private sector competitively bidding to go ahead and provide those resources.
Yeah, if I can just add, I would not be a proponent of a Crown Corp in Alberta. I think Edgardo made a point earlier that excess profits to shareholders of the generators. I mean, one only has to Google TransAlta's share price, the largest generator in Alberta. It's below where it was in 2000. There has not been excess profits, at least accruing to shareholders. Maybe it's waste within the company or something. I don't know. Apologies to anyone listening. But all I say is to point out, that has not been a boon, sort of something where we're losing there. If you look at long run energy prices, so not the volatility, if you just graph 5-year rolling average prices, Alberta's sort of been around 75, dropped to 60, went up to 80. Right around where you'd think a levelized cost of energy and type of supply would be. The very narrow, within a year type pricing goes up and down, but over the long run, it's smooth. The fear I have with the Crown Corp is in Alberta is it would simply be a tool to build or procure whatever the favored technology of the government in power is. And that's great if the benevolent dictator is on your side or shares your views. But the moment they start doing something differently, I mean, one only has to look at, say, Saskatchewan and BC to our left and right, two publicly owned Crown Corps going in very different directions at the behest of their very different governments right now. The only place where I see the value is in leveraging the low discount rate of a public entity for long lead assets. But that is unique to a public power versus you can have vertically integrated regulated systems that are privately owned, like Nova Scotia, for example, is a good one, where there might be, you're getting the sort of the private discount rates in a regulated world. So the public discount rates are something to consider if you're thinking about things that the market won't otherwise build, which it might be like large nuclear, large hydro.
Okay, thanks, Blake. Edgardo, are you wanting to?
Yeah, if
I'll give you a last word. I'll give you a last word.
Okay, thank you. All right. Yeah, look, I mean, the idea that the markets will make less mistakes and guide us in a better way than what a democratically elected political economy as a result of the voters providing their input to a government. I think we may have a disagreement with what is better, what is worse, right? I mean, crown corporations in Canada have an excellent reputation. They're the people's power. And I have a bit more faith in voters to be able to direct, their governments with a view to, what they want to do with a strategic sector like electricity that has so many important public interest issues such as affordability, reliability, and decarbonization. So I have no problem with the idea of a public power. Yes, of course, it's not perfect, but what is? But it is doing quite well and has traditionally had. I mean, the Canadian example, the Canadian model of public power is something to hold high from a global perspective. We are a very low emission country, mostly developed through hydro, mostly through pioneers of public power. So I have no problem with that concept.
Great. Thank you for all your different perspectives. And I think it's really interesting to dive into the different pieces and see all the gray areas here, because I also think, you don't necessarily need a crown corp, as I think maybe Alberta has shown us, to get democratically elected plays on the electricity sector, like I say, a pause on renewables or other interventions. So it's all kind of interesting and very hard to parse out, I think, as we get into details in the real world. So this has been a super rich conversation, and I really appreciate all of your perspectives. I want to move us on. Before we go to some questions from the audience, I want to step back a bit and do something I like to call the lightning round for the panelists. I mean, we've chosen you to join us here today because you're some of the most foremost experts in this country. So I want to see how deep your knowledge really goes. And we're going to start with a true or false round. So I'm going to ask you a true or false question. You all need to answer it, and we will see who comes up with the right take. I'm going to start with a real skill testing one. The same year that Canada built our last new nuclear generator was also the same year we won our last Stanley Cup. True or false?
False.
False from Len.
I want to say false. I feel like it's earlier than that, but I don't remember when we last won the cup.
But sorry. And Jane, who's we in terms of winning the Stanley Cup?
Oh, no. Oh, shoot. Canadians, let's say.
Okay. Because we're all over here.
That's true, actually.
Yeah.
Fair point.
Yeah, the Toronto Maple Leafs, it's been 1967, so that doesn't apply.
I don't know if this is a sad statement on our hockey capabilities lately or on our nuclear build capability.
Go Leafs, go.
I got two falses. Edgardo?
Well, if you're referring to we as in who could be the Oilers? False.
Guys, sadly, it's true.
Okay.
1993.
Sorry, who won the Stanley Cup?
I don't know, who was it even?
Montreal won in 1993. I thought the last Darlington was commissioned in 1990, which is why I gave it a false, but
Oh, you were very close. Very close.
That was Darlington. Yeah,
I appreciate
Darlington
it. Okay, I'm going to
4.
go easier on you.
I embarrassingly didn't realize it's been that long since we've had a cup.
I know, that's the saddest part. True or false, we trade more electricity with the states than between provinces?
True.
Okay, I just wanted you guys to feel good about yourselves. Okay, here's our last one. In 2022, Canada's revenue from electricity exports to the United States reached a record high of $3.5 billion. True or false?
I'm going to say
True.
it's low.
That
True.
seems too low. I'm going to go back to 2001 or so to think about records.
All right. Same with you, Leonard. It is false. It was actually 5.8 billion in 2022. Nicely done. Okay, great. Okay, now we're going to move on to the word association game. Brace yourselves because this is a lot harder. I'm looking for one word responses only to the following prompts, panelists. So I'm going to make a statement to one of you, one at a time, and you're going to react unfiltered with reckless abandon and give me one word in response to what I ask. Okay. Blake, what comes to mind when I say Alberta's 2023 moratorium on renewables?
Bad.
Okay. Edgardo, what comes to mind when I say increasing federal government control over Canada's electricity system, like FERC in the US?
Bad.
Okay. I like the certainty. Leonard, what comes to mind when I say vehicle to grid charging?
Impending.
Nice. Blake, what comes to mind when I say Canada's 2035 net zero electricity target?
Not happening.
Leonard, what comes to mind when I say energy affordability in remote northern communities?
Improving.
Nice. Edgardo, what comes to mind when I say affordable EVs from China?
Tariffs. Tariffs. That's what comes to mind.
Right. And last one, Leonard, what comes to mind when I say selling Crown Corps to private investors?
Dangerous.
Great. Excellent. Thank you all. Those are great responses. I feel like you all have future careers in the game show industry. Nicely done. Okay, I'm going to throw out some questions from the audience now, and anybody can just jump in and take them. Okay. On renewables, markets create price volatility that renewables must shield themselves from, usually using corporate PPAs. Are those PPAs sufficient to deploy an all renewables grid? If not, what creates price stability to get to net zero emissions? Anyone? Blake?
I guess the first thing I'd say is like renewables are no different than any other generator that faces price volatility. So the notion that renewables must shield themselves from that price is, I could apply that to any nuclear, hydro, anyone. There are folks that decide to take their power plants merchant and be exposed. So I sort of pull back from the premise of the question. To date, corporate PPAs have been prolific in terms of renewable generators who need to de-risk, likely for financing reasons, have been able to have access to that. Is that going to be the case in the future as we go forward? I'm not sure. One of the things that we're seeing is the holders of those contracts for differences, or the contracts on the other side, they're doing so for environmental reasons oftentimes, because the energy value of those renewables is declining in Alberta, because the more solar power you have, it all generates at the same time. We're seeing near zero prices through the middle of the day throughout the summer. So you get this cannibalism that occurs in terms of the value of the profile. So you're going to have some commercial buyers who feel that exposure to declining energy prices, who might be more reluctant going forward.
Great. Thank you very much. Leonard, this one's for you. Many markets, including Texas, seem to be taking advantage of pairing batteries with solar. What are the barriers to markets in Canada, especially in Alberta, to leveraging more grid batteries?
So my personal opinion is that batteries paired with renewables seems like something new, something, people don't know how to read them. But in my view, in Ontario, we have a century-long relationship with hydroelectric. And hydroelectric, is very similar to a renewable facility paired with some amount of storage. So some hydroelectric is run of river, but some of it has storage. It's got uncertain fuel. River systems sometimes have lots of water, sometimes not so much. And so I think that we have missed the opportunity to understand that solar plus a battery or a wind facility with a battery is actually very much like a resource that we've operated for a long time. It provides capacity, it provides energy, and it has been hard to convince decision makers in some places of the opportunity that is there. So I think it's been a missed opportunity. And what ends up happening is sometimes when you put batteries at different points on the system operator or the utility has to figure out how they're going to get the generation through the transmission system to the battery, store it, and then get it from the battery to the load. And if you co-locate batteries with a renewable facility, then you're just worried about transmission from that point of connection to the load. It becomes a much simpler system to operate. So I think we've missed a big opportunity to go ahead and put those technologies together and think of them as a combined entity.
Thank you. Edgardo, maybe you can answer this last one, and then I'll let you guys make some final remarks. How does the deregulated nature of the market influence resource planning at electric company level in Alberta?
Oof, that may be a bit too more detailed, but because I can't go behind the corporate screen of how people are thinking about that. But I think there are, to some of Blake's points and also to Len, there are limitations to financial markets that and also to shareholder returns that kind of limit the types of resources that are likely to be put in through a private market process, especially one that's deregulated. And so there's going to be a greater emphasis on faster deployment, which is a good thing, but also faster payback processes, and lower, more granular, less capital expense, less lumpy, right? So you get a system. It's not surprising, for example, in Alberta that for example, the huge transition that we've seen over the last 20 years of coal to gas, that it was gas, right? That's not a surprise, given that it's relatively, you can make them different sizes, you can put them up relatively quickly, and they have a relatively fast, payback period. There are some things, and that's because there are project financing and all kinds of other financing that are going to drive that private investment. But there are some things, and it could be that batteries may or may not be included, but for example, 80, 90, 100-year life assets, for example, like the Adam Beck plant or hydroelectric plant that we have in Ontario that just had 100 years anniversary. Fantastic. Nuclear plants are now in Ontario being refurbished and are likely to have 60, 70, 80-year. So there are certain things, just because of the imperfect, let alone the actual interest rate, but the actual kinds of capital markets that private enterprise can get into will necessarily limit the types of resources that they're likely to put in, and therefore shapes the entire generation mix to be looking more like a private mix rather than like a combined ownership mix of private and public, or let alone 100% public like the Crown Corps.
Thank you very much. Okay, guys, we have a few minutes left. I'm gonna put one last question to you all, just as a closing thought. So just maybe 1 minute each. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but those were great. So thank you very much. And here's my last question for panelists. What do you think is the most important action Alberta could take to achieve grid carbon neutrality by 2050? Let's go, Blake, Leonard, Edgardo.
Can I cheat and give a quick laundry list, Jane? Not a single?
If you keep it within 1 minute, yes.
1 minute. Maintain how TIER operates right now, where we have sector-wide benchmarks. So you get that big separation between the emission costs of natural gas and anything clean. That's critically important. I would say expanding our connections with our neighbors is something that doesn't seem very popular, but I don't see us decarbonizing effectively, quickly, and affordably without bigger connections to manage that variability. And get out of the way of what the market is building right now, which is lots of abundant wind and solar, but make sure the grid operator is doing its job and getting all of those ancillary services required to integrate all of that cheap energy, which is something we've been grappling with for the past little while, and they're working on rapidly.
Fantastic. Leonard.
So I'll build a little bit on what Blake said.
Okay.
Alberta has gone through and had great success with its energy-only market. But times are changing. You're moving into, significant changes on the power system, new technologies, increased focus on reliability. So I think that the most important thing that Alberta could do would be to be clear about what its goals are. Is reliability the primary thing to achieve? Recognize that the resource mix is changing and understanding what the impacts are. In a world of increased amounts of variable energy resources, and everyone's going to increased amounts of wind and solar, and even hydroelectric only has so much certainty to it. You're going to need new methods. You're going to need nimble ways to move megawatts between jurisdictions, and you're going to need the transmission to do it. So making sure that you understand the way that the world is changing and what you need to do to get there is going to be a key thing to understand and act upon.
Thank you so much. I really failed on the holding everyone to one thing Alberta could do, but these are all good suggestions. Over to you, Edgardo.
Thank you, Jane. And again, not to sound too much like a broken record, but I mean, two things. Reimposing economic regulation. Yeah, reimposing economic regulation and then returning to a balanced ownership mix by creating a Crown Corp. Those are the two things.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you for chatting with us today. It's been a great conversation. I really enjoyed talking to all of you. Thanks again to everyone who's listening. I want to let you know that the next Transition Accelerator webinar, The Case for Independent Intermediaries in Building a Competitive Clean Economy, we really need to get shorter titles going on here, but is going to be fantastic. It's Lessons from Propulsion Quebec. It will be a French language webinar on October 3rd. So please check our website for more details. And please also do take 1 minute to fill out our webinar survey and share what else you'd like us to cover for future webinars. So fantastic that you all could join us today. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you all.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.